Well, early last October, I received in the mail an unsolicited copy of a recently published book. And this is the sort of thing that happens periodically, since various publishing houses hope that as the minister of a large congregation, I will read that book and then I will recommend it to all of you. And to be honest, most of these books strike me as being rather mediocre, and thus they remain unopened, and they end up in one of those little free library kiosks that now grace so many of our neighborhoods. But this particular book, entitled Proof of Heaven, caught my attention. And turning it over, I saw that it was written by a man named Eben Alexander, a respected neurosurgeon, and that the story in the book was based upon his own near-death experience. And the book has enjoyed enormous popularity, selling over 2 million copies in the 9 months following its initial release. Now, in recounting his experience in this book, Dr. Alexander, a nominal Episcopalian and a self-described skeptic, he tells how he had been suddenly stricken in 2008 with a rare and deadly form of bacterial meningitis. And he lay in a coma for better than a week, during which time he found himself in the land that lies beyond death's door, or so he supposes. Now here the book begins to bear an uncanny resemblance to Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, for Eben finds and he is guided on his travels by a beautiful female figure, the counterpoint to Dante's beloved Beatrice. And from this unnamed woman, he receives this threefold assurance, and this is kind of the core of the book. She tells him, "You are loved and you are cherished dearly forever, that you have nothing to fear, and that there is nothing that you can do wrong." Now, Dr. Alexander awoke from this coma, utterly convinced that this person, this spirit, was real, and that he himself had experienced a foretaste of heaven, that it was his soul, his immortal essence, that had temporarily escaped the confines of his physical body and inexplicably been granted this particular privilege. At the risk of oversimplifying, he says, I was allowed to die harder and travel deeper than almost all other near-death experience subjects before me. A rather audacious claim, to be sure. Now, in attempting to explain what had happened to him, Alexander points to this raging meningitis that had caused, as he put it, his neocortical functions to shut down entirely. And thus, his comatose mind could not possibly have dreamed of anything, imagined anything whatsoever. The neocortical functions just did not exist. In fact, he now believes that the brain might actually block our access to knowledge of the higher worlds. We need to accept, at least hypothetically, he writes, that the brain itself does not produce consciousness, that it is instead a kind of reducing valve or filter shifting the larger non-physical consciousness that we possess in the non-physical world down to a more limited capacity that we can use in the physical world for the duration of our mortal lives. Now, Alexander acknowledges that he had grown up wanting to believe in God and heaven and the afterlife, but that he had forfeited his early religious faith in favor of a worldview prescribed by scientific materialism. But now it appears that that boyhood wish, that dream, had come to fruition. There is a soul. There is a heaven. Now, understandably, this book has not been without its critics. According to the emergency room physician who saw him initially, Alexander, when he came to the ER, was so agitated, so uncontrollable, that she had to place him in a chemically induced coma from which periodically he would emerge, rising into semi-consciousness. And she doubts that her patient's neocortex was completely non-functioning, as Alexander claims. And then there is the well-known neurosurgeon and neuroscientist Oliver Sacks, who suggested that the patient was really hallucinating, while allowing also that hallucinations can be powerfully convincing. The one most plausible hypothesis in Dr. Alexander's case, Sachs writes, is that the near-death experience occurred not during his coma, but as he was surfacing from the coma and his cortex was returning to full function. It is curious, he says, that Dr. Alexander does not allow for this obvious and natural explanation, but instead insists on a supernatural one. Now, this is but one of several books on near-death experiences that I have read over the course of my ministry, and in the end, I have to say that I remain agnostic about the anecdotal evidence that they offer as proof of a separable soul. I neither reject such anecdotal accounts out of hand, nor do I deny the possibility that there is more to us than our observable physiology. But ironically, Dr. Alexander's claims are not necessarily shared by other scientists of faith, other scientists who embrace a religious perspective. For their ideas about the soul and the afterlife can be very, very different. So take John Polkinghorne. He is a former professor of mathematical physics. He is a fellow of the British Royal Society, and he is an Anglican priest. But unlike even Alexander, Polkinghorne does not subscribe to this notion of an immutable, immortal soul. In his book, The Faith of a Physicist, Polkinghorne argues that such a stance, such a position, does not square with the teachings of the New Testament or conventional Christian theology, not to mention science. In Polkinghorne's view, nothing of us or about us will survive bodily death. And so he says, my understanding of the soul is that it is the almost infinitely complex, dynamic, information-bearing pattern carried at any instant by the matter of my animated body, continuously developing throughout the constituent changes of my bodily makeup during the course of my earthly life. But that whole psychosomatic unity is dissolved at the time of death. Polkinghorne denies the existence of an individual immortal soul, but he also affirms that our universe is governed by a supreme being who remembers the pattern that is me, and will thus recreate me in a new environment of his choosing and in his good time. Thus, death is real, but it is not the last word. I believe in the tradition that is truer, Polkinghorne says, and which relies on our hope of physical resurrection beyond death. Now, Polkinghorne is hardly an outlier in his views here, for many Christians count on being physically restored and perfected at the end of history while rejecting this notion of an immaterial, immortal essence that we call soul. For much of our history, the term soul, the term spirit, have been used interchangeably to describe that which animates the human organism. And these metaphysical concepts, whichever one you care to call it, have served to explain how this mere matter acquired the ability to move, to feel, to think, to imagine, to invent. The soul, we believed, was in the body, but not necessarily of it, and ultimately not dependent upon it. It was this vivifying force that could exist independently. And this understanding of soul, Polkinghorne's views aside, enjoys considerable popularity, and there are many variations on this basic theme. Classical Hinduism holds that the human soul has two components. There is the Atman, which is eternal, unchanging, and by its very nature, divine. And then there's this other entity called the Jiva, which is a quasi-material entity that accumulates karma through a succession of lifetimes and serves as a temporary container for the immortal Atman. And our ultimate aim, according to Hinduism, should be to rid ourselves of all karmic accretions so that the jiva will dissolve and the Atman can then return to its original home in Brahma. And only then can the painful cycle of birth and death and rebirth be finally and everlastingly broken. And so the cessation of individual existence and the reunion with the ultimate, with cosmic consciousness. This is the basic premise of Hinduism. This is the end and the goal, as it also is for Western Sufism, as you heard earlier, as it also is for Christian Gnosticism, all three of these traditions. And the soul also, in this metaphysical sense, it also figures prominently in the occult and the tantric traditions, where we find these stunning accounts of astral projection or soul travel. Mircea Eliade, the great student of myth and ancient history, says, "We know that in many cultures, people conceived of the soul as a bird. And while the majority of human beings are changed into birds only at the moment of death, sorcerers can emerge from their body in this world and as often as they wish." Now, many in my generation learned of such things by reading Carlos Castaneda's vivid accounts of the supernatural feats of Don Juan, that Yaqui Indian sorcerer, but we find similar accounts in many other traditions. But there are religious traditions that are not quite so sympathetic to such claims. The ancient Hebrews, they spoke of the soul, but they did not believe that it could exist apart from the body. And for his part, Gautama Buddha rejected the Hindu concept of the Atman, and he advocated for its opposite, anatta, no soul. According to the Theravadan Buddhist authority Wapola Sri Rahula, Buddhism stands unique in the history of human thought in denying the existence of such an entity. Through his own close and objective observation, the Buddha concluded that everything about us is in a state of flux. Body, perceptions, volition, emotions, with each impermanent element of us conditioning the appearance of the next impermanent element in a continuous sequence of cause and effect. And there is nothing behind all of this phenomena that can be called a permanent self or an Atman, according to the Japanese scholar Masao Abe. But then we ask, what about reincarnation? For the Buddha and his successors, what actually survives the death of the physical body is not an immaterial soul. It is just an impulse of sorts, a cause that our lives here on earth create that produces a noticeable effect on someone else. So, for example, if I am compassionate and helpful and kindly during my lifetime, I produce a cause, a blessing that can insinuate itself in the thought and the experience of a person perhaps yet to be born. That is reincarnation according to Orthodox Buddhist teaching. Now, for those of us who find all such religious and metaphysical theories of the soul to be unconvincing, well, the concept, I believe, can still prove to be useful. And when we say that a person is engaged in soul searching, we don't mean that they're looking for the Atman. What do we mean? We mean that they are consulting their conscience. They are trying to sort out right from wrong, figuring out what is the right thing to do. And when we say of a person, she is a person of real soul, it's because we have observed some admirable qualities in that person, an exceptional degree of kindness, sensitivity, integrity, or insight, perhaps. And so if you hear the word soul in a sermon, not necessarily this one, but an Orthodox one, it might mean something very different from when you read it in a novel or in a piece of poetry, Norman Cousins points out. And the concept becomes so tricky, so problematic for us, because it is so much contingent on the context in which we use it. And to fully appreciate it as a resource that can be valuable in the working out of our own lives, our own comings and goings, we have to change the context. We have to start thinking less metaphysically and more metaphorically, which of course is precisely what the poets are wont to do. And thus the Madison poet Donna Carnes writes, "An indigo deep snow moon dazzled my serious soul all night long." Which of us cannot relate to that little fragment of poetry in these winter seasons? And then there is our own Patricia Freires writing about practicing yoga near Lake Wingra. And as she and her companions were practicing, there was this great blue heron silently observing her perched at the end of a pier. And Patricia writes, "We practice aching what heron knows. her ease, her poise? Does she know us for kindred spirits? Do we do her soul good as she does ours? Thank you, Pat. Now, contemporary civilization has often been described as soulless, without soul, because of its insatiable appetite for money, power, willy-nilly development, untrammeled innovation, technocratic problem-solving, and realities filtered through and altered by the electronic media. And as a people, we are thus said to be overstimulated and undernourished. The 20th century was a kind of a windstorm, Christian Wyman wrote recently in The American Scholar, a windstorm scouring of all we thought was knowledge and truth and ours, until that windstorm became too strong for us, or we too weak for it, and the self replaced the soul with the fist of survival. And so Wyman and others describe how anxiety, at both the individual and the collective level, has spiked in recent decades, as our sense of self has become less substantial and estranged increasingly from family and community. It buckles and wavers under the strain, Wyman warns, and eventually and inevitably it will break. So what we need then is a recovery of the deeper self that we might call the soul, not in the metaphysical, but in the more earthly and mundane sense of that word. The soul not as a thing, but as a quality of experience, a way of being that is more cognizant of and essentially connected to the people around us and to the world at large. According to the popular Jungian writer and therapist Thomas More, we begin to live more soulfully when our sense of wonder is rekindled, when there is a growing reverence toward ourselves, our neighbors, and the world that causes us to think twice before we engage in exploitive or self-aggrandizing behavior. And so one of the most important gifts of the soul, Thomas More writes, is the voice of conscience, which plays a central role in human creativity, teaching us where to place limits and how to protect our common humanity. And without this soul, he says, human creativity turns into uninhibited self-destructive productivity, a sign of the untethered and disassociated spirit. The untethered and the disassociated spirit. Now here's what's interesting. Thomas More draws a clear distinction between the spirit and the soul, between spirituality and soulfulness. The former, spirituality, he says, motivates us to transcend the personal, the concrete, the finite particulars of this world. Onward and upward forever is the way that our 19th century forebears put it. And in this sense, spirituality can have as much to do with technology and science as with religion, because technology and science are these vehicles for moving ever upward and onward. But when this impulse is divorced from soul, it can lead to a devaluation of the world and indifference to its well-being and its beauty. And so according to Robert Sardello, another Jungian, we suffer from a diseased consciousness, a consciousness devoid of soul. That is as much responsible for today's social and ecological crises as any amount of poor planning and lack of adequate information. Recovering and then growing a soul, that is a task to be carried out in daily life as we learn to slow down and to attend more closely. It is not about curing or fixing or changing or adjusting or making anything more healthy, Thomas More says. It remains patiently in the present, close to life as it presents itself day by day. It has to do with modest care and not with miraculous cure. And this is very much in keeping with the chop wood, carry water approach to spirituality that we find in Zen Buddhism. It is of a piece with the parables and the unpretentious lifestyle of Jesus of Nazareth. It has much in common with the timeless advice of the ancient Chinese sage Lao Tzu, who said, "See the world as yourself. Have faith in the way things are. Love the world as yourself, and then you will be able to care for all things." Love the world as yourself, Lao Tzu urges. For that to happen, we need a restoration of soul. For that is the part of our humanity that turns perception into communication, communication into communion, and from that communion, love and the impulse to care springs forth. We do not exploit, we do not neglect, we do not destroy that with which we enjoy communion. Now, caught up as we all are in our urbanized, hyperactive, distracted world, the world that we have created, soul may seem to us to be an antiquated and perhaps even an irrelevant idea to hold on to, one that simply does not comport any longer with the conditions of modern life. And if that is our conclusion, if that's how we feel, well, there's always the metaphysical alternative, that other soul whose destiny lies in some unsullied world beyond our own. But let us be, for the time at least, citizens of this world, concerned for its future, open to its pain and its grandeur, as good a place as any to fulfill ourselves as soulful and spiritual beings. May it be so.